to share her knowledge with us on North Carolina purchasing laws.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Dare County. We're glad to have you here. I actually live here. I live about 5 minutes away. So, really, really great that you all invited me to spend time with you this morning because I got to come home last night. Remind my husband I still existed, pick up a bit of underwear that was laying around on the floor, etc. Because I normally work in Chapel Hill, or every week I'm at Chapel Hill. I come home on the weekend. So it's really great to be here. I understand you all wanted to have a little brush up on basic purchasing. And glad we have an actual purchaser in the room, so you are welcome to tell me if I say anything wrong. We're going to cover not as much as you have in these slides. I believe the slides are posted on your website, or will be posted on your website. So I've included more information in the slides than we're going to cover today, so that you have those slides as a resource. In particular, we're going to talk about basic contract requirements, procurement methods, the requirements for those procurement methods. Spend a little time talking about the IT RFP option as a refresher. The exceptions to purchasing is what I'm not going to intend to cover today, but I do want you to know that that's part of the slide presentation so that you have those exceptions as reference materials. And if you have any particular questions about a particular exception, when can we sole source, when can we piggyback, happy to spend a few minutes answering particular questions if anything is burning in your mind. And I'll close with offering you a few resources that we have at the school. The world of purchasing and contracting is exciting, right? You think, you're laughing at me. I love talking about bid thresholds. I love talking about the lowest responsible bidder standard of award. This is really cool stuff. You think this is exciting, invite me back to talk about property disposal, which is another area that I work in. We can talk about that. You also laugh, but I was doing a purchasing training up in, purchasing training up in Yadkin County about 2 years ago. Do you remember when the big earthquake hit North Carolina, and Yadkin County, Yadkinville was pretty much at the epicenter of the impact in North Carolina. I was right in the middle of a presentation of city and county staff on purchasing and department heads when the earthquake hit, and I was just at the point of talking about bid thresholds. So I can now say that bid thresholds is really an earth-moving topic. Okay, that's about as much of a joke as I can come up with purchasing laws. But let's start out with a little, are you smarter than a purchasing officer? Only two bit. Now let me stop for just a second. We're going to be focusing on state law and talk a bit about local policies, but we're focusing on state law. And so all of these questions are based on state law. Only 2 bids are received for purchasing an IT system costing $95,000. Only 2 bids. Can you open? How many of you say yes under state law? How many of you say no? Do you want me to tell you the answers now, or do you want to wait with bated breath and anticipation as we go through? We're going to wait. Local vendor's bid is only $250 higher than an out-of-state vendor. Can you award to the local vendor? How many of you think you can? How many of you think no? Okay, those of you that aren't raising your hands, are you stupefied? Are you still waking up? Do you need coffee? Or are you just not sure? Okay, rereading. You're giving this some thought. So what do you think?
Yes.
Just based on the fact that the vendor is local. You think so? Okay. We'll come back to that too. It's all right. All right. Next one. FedEx delivers a bid late through no fault of the bidder. There's a scheduled date and time for a formal bid opening, and FedEx delivers it late. Can you accept the bid? How many of you think yes? How many of you think no? Okay. Doing good. Your bidder, one of your bidders, notices that there's a calculation error after you open his bid. Can you allow him to correct his mistake after the bid's been opened? Anybody say yes? How many say no? Yeah, this one's a definite no. A vendor asks you to keep bid documents confidential after the bid opening because they are proprietary. Oops, I forgot the closed quotation mark, sorry about that. Can you keep it proprietary? Keep it closed, keep it confidential? You saying yes? How many do you think no? How many do you think the Public Records Act is going to control? Yeah. Okay, we're going to talk about that. Do y'all ever run into that, I guess, in dealing with IT companies, software vendors, et cetera? And parts of it, right. You know, this is proprietary. We'll talk about that. So we're focusing on the law, not practical applications and best practices so much, but the law does inform those, and some of this you're going to find out as we go through and brush up on your memory of all of these laws, that sometimes the law doesn't tell you what the answer is, and that's when you turn to best practices. But we're going to be focusing on the law. Where do the legal requirements come from that you have to follow? We have actually 3. Statute is 1. How many of you have local purchasing policies? It's very common. And state law, the statutes, is exactly right. What is the GMCR? Anybody know? Grants Management Common Rule. How many of you handle federal funds? How many of you handle stimulus funds? You got stimulus money. The government did, you may not have handled them. There are separate procurement requirements. I'm not going to go into federal law very much, but just as a disclaimer and a warning, federal grants come with federal procurement requirements that are not necessarily the same as state law. So you might have a situation, you're always going to have a situation where you have at least one of those circles applying to you. What's that? Right, you're always going to be subject to local policies. You're also always going to be subject to state law. State law is going to apply whether you're using state funds or local funds or federal funds. You always have to follow state law as well. Federal law comes in if you're handling federal funds. So it would be nice if all those different laws and policies were identical to each other, right? Do you think that's the case? No. That's way too, we're in government, that would make life way too easy, right? So what do you do if you find yourself in a situation where your local policy provides one thing, state law provides something else, and then if you're handling federal funds, federal law provides something different? What do you do? The most restrictive rule, yes. You follow the most restrictive rule. Whichever rule, that's the easiest rule of thumb, and this is especially true when you're dealing with the differences between state law and your local policies, because you're always going to be subject to both of those, no matter what source of funds you're spending. Follow the most restrictive rule. So what is a contract? Also helpful to understand what a contract is, because competitive bidding requirements apply to government contracts, letting or entering into government contracts. So here's the fancy legalese definition of a contract. A contract basically is a combination of an offer. I offer to do something for you. You put out a bid. I offer to provide you the service or sell you the product. You accept my offer, and there's consideration that is binding our deal. What is consideration? What can consideration be?
Money.
Money. Typically it's money. Is that the only thing it can be? Under contract law, not necessarily. It could be exchanging a service for a service. It could be money or some combination of money plus a service. So consideration is a thing of value, typically money, but it doesn't legally have to be just money, that binds the deal between the two of you, the two parties, and then you have your basic contract. So what is a gift of contract? What do you think? I am going to, because you're from Pender County and y'all had lots of bad weather down there, and I'm really impressed that you made it here today. Pender, right? You said Pender? Yeah, I'm going to buy you drinks this afternoon after y'all are done. Just because I'm just really impressed that you're here. All right, so it comes about 4 o'clock, and I went, sorry, I got something else to do. Did we have a binding contract? Do you have a cause of action to sue me, to force me to perform on my offer to you of taking you out for drinks? Why not? We'll get into that. even more fundamental than that, because verbal contracts can be binding, but not in the context of government anymore since last November. We'll get back to that. No consideration, that's exactly right. I made an offer to you and you accepted it, but what is the consideration? What's the thing of value that was exchanged between us? Nothing. Right, that's exactly right. It's come up sometimes in litigation over, can you guess what? Broken wedding engagements. He's given the ring and he wants that ring back, and she don't want to give it back. So the concept that a gift is not a contract is actually something that's been litigated, unfortunately, in the context of broken engagements sometimes. So are these contracts? Is there anything on this list that you think does not represent a contract? Think broadly of offer, acceptance, consideration. That's exactly right. All of these take the form of a contract, assuming that it meets all of the applicable legal requirements. And the point of that is that bidding laws apply to contracting. And a contract doesn't necessarily have to be the formal legalese document your attorney has drawn up that has all that Shakespearean, wherefore art thou kind of Romeo language in it. It can be something as simple as a PO or a credit card purchase, a P card purchase. So now we're going to go down a bit deeper. We've started out broadly with the contract so that you know what the bidding laws apply to. Now we're going to talk about the legal requirements for a public contract, meaning a contract entered into by a public entity. This represents the various components, if you will, of legal requirements, or buckets of legal requirements for public contracts. And if a public contract is entered into not in compliance with this whole wheel of requirements, so to speak, then if challenged, your contract will likely be held null and void by the courts. What does null and void mean? Not legal. It technically even means it doesn't even exist legally, but it's certainly not binding. You can't enforce it. And you lose your legal authority to make payments under that contract under the Local Government Budget Fiscal and Control Act. And if anybody, with your finance folks, if one reason why you find finance being really, really particular about these bidding requirements, and did you let the contract legally, is because under Chapter 159, the Local Government Budget Fiscal and Control Act, they actually have, there's the potential for penalties against them for making payments under a contract that doesn't comply with certain legal requirements. So you don't want to end up in a situation where you have a void contract. Yes, sir.
Probably just saying to say it, but I think the answer is yes. If we enter into a contract and our board members change, they can trigger the contract.
No, you're probably thinking of the general rule that one legislative body cannot bind a future body. Is that what you're thinking of? That's not true in the case of contracts. Once a contract is entered into, it becomes a legally binding obligation on the unit of government itself, not just the board, the unit of government itself. And so the only way a new board could get out of that contract without there being penalties or damages potentially assessed against the unit of government is going to be under the terms and conditions of that contract. Now, if they have a legitimate basis for getting out of the contract because the other party has breached the contract, that gets you just back into basic contract law. Or if there's a termination clause, and they exercise the termination clause. But they can't just exercise well, we're a new board, so we don't want to be bound by the previous board's action. That does not apply. That principle, legal principle, does not apply to contracts.
So are there any situations where a board is acting on behalf of the board and not the organization?
Not when it comes to public contracting, no.
Okay.
No, because the board is acting on behalf of the unit of government. Individual board members have no legal authority, really, except for a few instances with mayors and board chairs. As a general proposition, the board is simply the decision-making body for the unit of government. And so any contract that they award, or any contract that they approve, or any contract that is entered into by the manager or a department head is a contract that binds the unit of government itself. If Lee signs off on an IT contract, the parties to that contract are not Lee and the vendor. The parties to the contract are Dare County and the vendor. And while the board has legal authority over that, they don't have over the operations of the county in that contract, ultimate legal authority, they don't have the ability to operate outside of the terms and conditions of that contract.
But what if the league is not authorized to be a signer on the contract?
Ah, that's a great question. That actually goes to the question of authority, and we'll get to that in a minute,
Okay.
but let me answer that since it's on your mind right now. Authority is different from execute. Execute simply means who is the one who signs the contract. An written execution or signing the contract simply signifies the unit of government's intent. That's the evidence of the government's intent to be bound by that contract. Authority means I am the person who has the legal authority to bind the unit of government. It's much more weighty, if you will, than just the authority to sign the contract. And technically, under the law, if the individual who awards the contract does not have the legal authority to act on behalf of the unit of government, it has not met one of those requirements for being a valid public contract. Now, authority can take the form of an actual written, it's in your job description, the board has adopted a resolution that says you have the authority to enter into IT contracts on behalf of Robinson County, or and so that's called explicit authority. There is something that explicitly gives you that authority. There is also implicit authority that speaks to the custom, pattern, and practice of your unit of government. If your IT director for the last 20 years has been the one who has let your IT contracts, the court could look to that as evidence that you have been given that authority implicitly because nobody's told you not to do it. Procurement methods. Any other questions about basic public contracts? We're going to now narrow down a bit more and start focusing in on procurement methods. And I'm saying procurement and not saying purchasing for a reason. Why do you think that is? Purchasing is one form of procurement. Procurement is defined as the method by which you obtain the goods or services that the unit of government needs. One form of procurement is purchasing. So if you hear me say procurement and you're thinking purchasing, it's kind of one and the same, but purchasing is a subunit of procurement. So that's why you see the word procurement. There's a very simple formula. Hopefully it's simple. By the way, you're going to notice lots of these circle graphs. You probably recognize it as smart art, because you guys are IT folks, right? You're going to see a lot of that because that's the smart art that you know how to use the best. So if it starts feeling repetitive, my apologies in advance. Type of contract. This is our simple formula. If you know the type of contract that you were dealing with, and you know its cost, you will be able to then determine what the procurement method is that applies to it. So if you are looking at a particular, we want to enter into, we're going to put out bids for X, and I need to know whether or not I have to advertise for 7 days in the newspapers, is subject to formal bid opening requirements, do I have to have a public bid opening, is there a bid bond required, et cetera, is this formal or informal bidding, is this a service contract not subject to anything? All of those questions can be answered through this simple formula. Because once you know the type of contract you're dealing with, and you know the cost of that contract, you will then know under the statutes of our state what procurement method applies, or whether a procurement method applies at all. So let's start with our analysis. First, type of contract. For purposes of state bidding laws, we divide the universal contracts that local governments enter into 4 basic categories. And the first is purchases. So now you're getting ready to see why I use the term procurement when I've been speaking broadly as opposed to purchasing. Purchases. Under the statutes, purchases are defined as a contract for the acquisition of apparatus, supplies, materials, and equipment, or as we say in our fancy school of government legalese, stuff. Anything that's personal, tangible personal property. Laptops, vehicles, tables, chairs, anything you can pick up and carry with you. Office supplies, chemicals for the waste treatment plant. Tangible, something you can hold in your hand. That's a purchase. Second type of category, can you guess what it might be?
Services?
We'll get to services in a minute. Construction or repair. This is legally the way it's set up under the statutes. Construction or repair. It's the second type of contract for purposes of our bidding laws. And this is new construction as well as repair. And And so construction, both in the context of vertical construction, buildings, water towers, cell phone towers, water tanks, etc., and horizontal construction. What would an example of horizontal construction be?
Roads.
Oh, look, yeah, oh, helpfully, utility roads, et cetera. That type of construction called et cetera. Yeah, paving roads, if you're a city, utility lines, water sewer systems, et cetera, paving a parking lot, that's vertical, or horizontal construction. So that's the second type. We've got purchases, construction, repair. We have a special type of contract that I refer to as our Mini Brooks Act contracts, or design services contracts. And that's when you're hiring an architect, engineer, a surveyor, or construction manager at risk. I have no cute acronym that I can give you to help you remember the particular types of services that fall under this procurement method, but I don't know the degree to which you all deal with architects and engineers very much, so the Mini Brooks Act is probably not as relevant to you as it would be someone else.
Well, what about if we hire someone to design some sort of network architecture for our infrastructure, like a virtual server infrastructure?
Okay.
That's not infrastructure.
Now, when you say design architect, are you meaning somebody who is a licensed architect?
No.
Who is drawing plans? You're talking about architect in the sense of our website has scaffolding, which does not mean literally we have the big platforms outside, but it's the internal workings. I'm not very good at IT, by the way, in case you have not already figured that out, so I'm going to mangle. Shannon Tufts has been teaching me IT lingo, and I'm getting there. I'm getting there.
Yeah, that's basically what.
Okay, so that most likely is not going to be engineering or architecture that requires licensure for performing those services.
Okay, so
So when I'm talking about architectural and engineering, I'm talking about the people who draw plans for buildings, or the engineers that would design a stormwater runoff system or a bridge. In other words, the work they do requires them to be licensed by either the architect's board or the engineer's board or the surveyor's board.
Okay.
Now, we'll get to with the IT RFP, I'll have an example of where an IT project might actually involve a licensed engineer, as opposed to somebody who's doing engineering in the sense that they're designing something for you, but they're not actually a licensed engineer.
I'm thinking more, I guess, if we're talking about new construction, maybe rolling out a fiber optic network, something like that, where, again, you're building out horizontally. So.
Now, when you roll out a fiber optic network, in my simple brain, I'm envisioning great big rolls with a lot of cable wrapped around and big spools, and you're just...
And that's
Okay.
non-vertical, I mean.
Right. Now, I mean, literally, when you roll out a fiber optic network, what does that mean? What do you, physically, what is happening?
If you've ever seen people work on power lines.
Oh, that kind of roll. Oh, okay, and they're putting,
Yes.
maybe you're doing it underground, so
Yeah.
you're putting in
Non-vertical.
6 piping, and then you're pulling the cabling through the pipe, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That absolutely would be construction and repair.
What do you mean by at risk?
Construction management at risk is a certain type of construction method. There is a general contractor would be hired to oversee the construction project. They're not actually doing the work themselves, they're acting as the manager of the construction project, and they guarantee total not to exceed cost for that project. And if the project goes over cost, for reasons that are not beyond the control of that contractor, then he is at risk, and he has to, in essence, eat that overage.
And he has to show that he has that to back himself up before he can even accept it or be awarded a job. Don't they have to have the capital?
Oh, there's bonding requirements,
Right.
yes. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And he has to be a CM at risk has to be a licensed general contractor. But it's a particular type of construction method. It's not, you wouldn't hire a CM at risk under a construction or repair method because you're thinking, why? Yeah, normally if you're gonna hire a general contractor, you're gonna put it out to bid under the procurement methods that apply to a construction repair project. When you hire a CM at risk, you actually are hiring them under the Mini Brooks Act, and I'll get to what that means in just a minute, the qualifications-based selection project, because he's not actually doing the construction work. He's overseeing the construction project. and working with the architect on design aspects of it. So he's more like a design professional. He's providing that service as opposed to actually being the GC on the job. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Fourth, so we've got purchases, construction and repair, Mini Brooks Act, and then we have, again, this fancy legal term, the everything else category. So for purposes of our state's bidding laws, if it's not a purchase contract, it's not a contract for construction or repair, it's not a contract that falls under the Mini Brooks Act, it's in the everything else category, and that is primarily service contracts. What tends to come up in this category is service contracts and land acquisition, a unit of government purchasing a piece of real property. Real property, not personal property, that's a purchase, but real property. We're gonna buy this piece of land for our new courthouse or whatever. So those are the 4 types of contracts. That's the first part of our formula.
So would that be like, PM or annual service on a UPS or generator contract?
I have no idea what a UPS is. Okay, I know what a generator is. Is he talking about the kind of generators we're thinking of? Okay.
Yeah.
When the power goes out, you have generators.
The
Now,
battery.
right, we're buying a battery. We're getting ready to get into that very point. Because sometimes your contracts, I mean, it's a great example, sometimes your contracts, it's gonna be obvious what type it is. I'm gonna buy new office chairs. Clearly, that's a purchase. But sometimes you're not quite sure what it is, what category it falls into. Or, even more confusingly, a contract will have multiple components. It's a hybrid. So, let's reinforce this a bit, and I'm spending a little bit of time on this because you can't get to what procurement method applies or whether you do or don't have to informally bid it or formal bid it or require bid bonds or any of that stuff until you know what kind of contract you're dealing with. So this is, I would say, critical or fundamental to understanding and following competitive bidding laws. So if you're buying or installing new carpet, what kind of contract is that? What do you think? Is that a purchase or is that a service contract?
Well, it could be both.
Okay.
Depends if you do the work or somebody else.
Okay. Now, under our bidding laws, this is a preview of coming attractions. Each of those 4 types of contracts have different procurement requirements. So you can't mix and mingle. There's not a, you have 2 choices up here. There's not a 3rd choice under the bidding laws. There's not a both. So you gotta pick one or the other.
Purchase.
So how many of you say purchase? How many of you say service? Maybe you aren't sure. What do you mean by that?
Whichever is the largest part of the contract.
And that's called, Bill, oh, very good, and that means what? Do you know what we refer to that as?
No.
You're exactly right, though. The predominant aspect rule. I would say this is a purchase contract. Why?
The cost more than the.
service itself.
That's a very good factor to look at, the cost, and that's oftentimes how you answer this question. The predominant aspect rule means, what is the main thing you're getting under this contract? What's the main goal of this contract? What's
Have carpet installed.
That's right.
It's not like we're renewing software license or anything.
Yeah,
like that.
exactly.
So
What's the purpose of this contract? To get this carpet, right? What is carpet? A tangible thing, it's stuff. Not like a service agreement or a warranty, it's a tangible thing.
And the service wouldn't be required if you were buying a new carpet.
Exactly. The service is incidental to buying the carpet. So that's a purchase contract. How about this one? GIS mapping. What do you think? Is it a service or is it covered under the Mini Brooks Act?
Service.
Okay, how many of you think service? How many of you think Mini Brooks? Very good. How do you know that? I'm impressed.
Good guess.
Oh,
Honest.
Because we've got to have some type of engineer or
Yeah,
a company
yeah,
come
that's
in and have us design how we want the GIS system laid out, whether it's layers, what
Yep.
data needs to go on those layers, et cetera.
That's exactly right. By the way, I know nothing about GIS. I just found this image on Google Images trying to impress you guys. But thank you. Yeah, well, you can find anything on Google Images. And because I'm using it for educational purposes, I don't have to worry about copyright. I figured it's on Google Images, it's open source, right? Yes, sir.
We have people that do GIS and they're not licensed.
Okay. GIS mapping. Now, when you say we have people who do GIS, what does that mean?
Mapping.
Okay?
I think-
If you are staff, that's different.
You have to go out and
But if
secure
you're
a
hiring
contract.
somebody to do certain types of GIS
certain
mapping,
types. But I mean, if you're getting a surveyor to plot out a piece of property, that's one thing
yeah,
for your GIS. But
Yeah.
just getting someone to do data collection.
Is different.
Is different.
But
right.
surveys under the mini brook.
Yes,
Surveying is
survey
also
would be
under mini brooks. That's
brooks.
exactly right. God, I forgot I was talking to IT people when we did GIS mapping.
If you have a bunch of people. in the
I
field
looked
getting-
this up one time, and here's the general answer to the question, so that we don't commit the sin of wandering deeply into an area where Norma doesn't know the particular mechanics of GIS mapping. But there is GIS map, certain categories of activity associated with GIS mapping are required to be performed by a licensed engineer. There's a section in the engineer statutes that applies to GIS mapping some types of activities, not everything associated with GIS mapping. And you have to then go to the North Carolina Administrative Code, the regulations that have been promulgated by the Engineer and Surveyors Licensing Board, where they have a list of about 20 different activities that are directly associated with GIS mapping that they have determined do or do not require licensure.
So somebody needs to know that stuff, if you're gonna get into GIS mapping.
Yes, and so
Right.
the point of this is, there are some activities that actually require licensure, and you need to be careful, because if licensure is required, if it involves
Yeah.
architect or engineering work, and licensure is required, you have to use the Mini Brooks Act. You can't treat it as a service contract.
Or it would be binding, or the contract could be not
That's right.
binding. It's-
That's exactly right, the contract could be null and
Well,
void.
you could get away with, you could do it, but if it came back,
Right,
I think
That's
the problem that I have with it is that typically if you talk about engineers, say we have an engineer that's working with our public works department for water
Yes.
distribution.
that's right.
Okay? The GIS aspect of what they do is going to be incidental to the actual, to most of the work. They're going to provide digital copies of their.
And in that instance, that you would have had to comply, they would have had to comply with the Mini Brooks Act anyway,
Right.
so it doesn't really matter.
Okay.
they're covered.
Yeah, you're covered either way.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Yeah, I see what you're thinking. So let's say I hired an engineer to do some engineering design work for my waste treatment. I'm going to expand the waste treatment system. Part of that design work involves GIS mapping. Well, I've got to use the Mini Brooks Act to hire that engineer to begin with. So the fact that he's also going to be doing GIS mapping, that just falls under the scope of his license.
But I think in general, when we're talking about GIS mapping, most of the licensed professionals that you're going to be dealing with are going to be, the GIS aspect of it is going to be incidental, I would think.
Right.
I could be wrong.
Well, and what I'm telling you is that if you're having to hire an engineer, you're gonna have to use Mini Brooks either way.
Yeah.
And I would be happy to, since this obviously is a topic of great interest in this audience, when we stop for lunch, so as not to spend the whole morning on GIS mapping, I'll pull up the general statutes and just show you all where. And I think I actually have this on our purchasing website.
So I don't know if it's quite related to this, but does it matter if the certification or license is required for the work versus, and one that I'm thinking of is the RCDE, licensing director, structure table certifications.
Mhm.
You can have structure cabling done without an
Yes.
RCDE, or you may want to bring in an RCDE to do work, which from what I see right here is under the Big Roads Act, the RCDE, but just a normal vendor.
Mhm. Oh, there's my Coast cans, that make you. Yes, your question is there a distinction legally for purposes of bidding laws between licensure and certification? Is that your question?
Well, yeah, I guess it's when it's required. So
When it's
you may
required,
be
yes.
required to have somebody.
You
with a
may be
license for
required by state law to have, an engineer may be, under state law, a licensed engineer would be required to perform the particular type of design work that you're seeking.
certain- Right.
Because of the nature of the project, you may want specialized certification. You can put that requirement in your bid specs. You don't have to do it, but you can.
So when it's not required, but it's, but you want to,
Yeah,
does it still fall under the New Brooks Act?
it's gonna fall under the Mini Brooks Act if you're hiring somebody for architect or engineering services. And so if there's additional qualifications, additional certification that you want that firm, the person you hire to have, you can require that as part of your bid process. But you'd still be going under the Mini Brooks Act if the basic work required licensure. So, clearly we could spend all day on this. Computer system with a warranty, purchase or service? Why?
Management considerations.
That's right. The warranty comes along. You wouldn't get the warranty without the new system, right? That's exactly right. Smartphones with a master service agreement, purchase or service?
Service.
Who said service?
I do.
Why?
Because you're paying for the service of having telephone service, not the actual telephone.
Of course, you guys are IT people, you understand that. Other audiences get this one wrong invariably because they focus on the tangible item, the phone. And you're absolutely right. This is a service contract because what you are paying for is the service of the data charge, the whatever else comes along.
Half the time they'll give you the phone.
Oftentimes, yeah. Oftentimes, yeah, they will. And you can change the phone, right? You can get it, change out a different phone. It's like you were saying within the conjunction of the carpet. That's a one-time fixed acquisition, whereas this service agreement was oftentimes are structured as multi-year or at least 1 year with renewal options, and the phones just come along with it. Lease of copiers with an option to purchase.
Purchase,
Why do you think it's purchased?
because you're going to, if you have the option to purchase, then you can acquire it at the end of the lease. So it's purchase.
I'm impressed. That's exactly right.
$2
That's really good, because there is most people get that wrong too. They think the option means it's really, I'm just getting the service. And normally a lease is a service. But there's a specific statute in the bidding statute, in Article 8 of Chapter 143, that specifies leases with an option to purchase have to be treated as a purchase, whereas all other leases are treated as a service contract. Because even if you don't exercise the option, the fact that legally you have the ability to, at the end of that lease, acquire ownership of that stuff, that tangible item, that makes it a purchase. Very good. Okay. Well, we've talked about type of contract. Now let's talk about cost. And this one's pretty simple. For purposes right now, I want you to just remember dollar amounts, okay? This, by the way, was the point of the presentation where the County year started shaking. Pictures started falling off the wall. It's just raining outside, so I don't think anything nearly as monumental is going to happen now. So cost, there are magic dollar amounts. 30,000. I'm sorry, am I in your?
That's all right.
I need to stand here. 30,000, 90,000, and 500,000. These are bid thresholds, and these bid thresholds apply to purchase and construction and repair contracts, and they trigger different levels, accelerated, if you will, levels of statutory requirements for entering into that contract. So you put the type of contract and cost together and you get to your procurement method. And once again, we have 4 types of procurement methods that apply to contracts. We have informal bidding. Informal bidding applies to purchase and construction and repair contracts in a certain dollar threshold. I'll show you that in just a minute. The main focus of informal bidding is to award the contract to the low bidder who is also a responsible bidder and whose bid complies with all the legal requirements for that bid. But it's not exclusively cost, but your focus is best bang for the buck, for the taxpayer's buck. Formal bidding applies to purchase and construction and repair contracts, and it has, as the name suggests, more formal procedural requirements. But again, you're still focusing primarily, although not exclusively, on cost. The QBS process, qualifications-based selection process, it's referred to as the QBS process, is what applies to your Mini Brooks Act contracts. And this is the opposite. The selection, the policy and the method of making your selection is the opposite of informal and formal purchasing, bidding requirements for purchase and construction and repair. Under the QBS process, as the name suggests, qualifications-based selection, your predominant focus when you evaluate the proposals you've gotten in from an architect firm or engineering firms, is to look at the qualifications of the firm. And you initially make your selection, you rank based on the qualifications of the firm, not thinking about the cost, not thinking about what their fee is going to be or the total cost is going to be. In fact, state law prohibits you from even soliciting a total estimated cost for those services when they respond to your request for their qualifications. And you can only begin to know, you can only factor in cost or talk about contract costs, negotiate costs, after you've ranked the firms based on their qualification and you've selected your most qualified, the one you think is the best. And then you go and negotiate with them and reach agreement on what the contract costs will be. So fundamentally, the QBS process focuses on primarily the qualifications of the firm without cost being taken into account. Finally, there's the RFP process, and you all use RFPs, right? And the RFP process, it tends to be used, there's the option for IT goods and services, we'll get to that in a minute, and other service contracts. And the RFP process is focusing on getting good proposals, getting good value, and also looking at cost. So we've got our 4 types of contracts, our bid thresholds, and our 4 types of procurement methods. Let's pull all this together. Our 4 types of contracts are what? Purchase, construction and repair, mini brooks, and everything else, right. Our bid threshold, the magic dollar amounts are 30, 90, and 500, that's right. And now we have our 4 types of bidding methods. Formal bidding, that has the most formal and stringent procedural requirements, apply to purchase contracts that cost $90,000 and above. So remember that bid threshold of 90, that triggers formal requirements for purchases. That means the estimated cost of the contract. And for construction and repair, at $500,000. Informal bidding requirements are triggered for both purchase and construction and repair contracts if the estimated cost of the contract is $30,000. Mini Brooks Act, what do you think is going to end up over here? The Mini Brooks Act, the qualifications-based selection process applies regardless of the dollar amount of the contract. It doesn't matter if you're letting a $500 contract for an architect or an engineer or a $5 million contract. Unless the unit exempts itself from the requirements of the Act, the Mini Brooks Act is going to apply. So what do you think, what procurement method applies in the everything else category and construction and repair and purchase contracts below $30,000? What's You think informal bidding? Okay.
Below 30,000?
Below, for purchase and construction and repair contracts, below 30,000, we've got a gap here we need to fill. And the everything else category, we've got a gap. What's going to go there? What do you think is going to, I'm going to get ready to click. When I click, by the way, as IT people, I want you to be impressed with my ability.
That's impressive.
I'm not going to tell you how many hours this took, but, now what do you think? So we have one suggestion, informal bidding. Other suggestion, what do you think?
I think it can be informal.
You think informal bidding? Anybody else? Whatever. Whatever is not one of our 4 procurement methods. Did you see whatever up there as an option? Unless you're going, whatever. Yeah, any other guesses? Okay. No method required. The answer is under state law. Not, you're talking about your local police.
That's whatever.
That's IT
Whatever I
lingo.
wanna do.
Oh, I didn't, okay. Well, whatever I want to do, you're exactly right. Yes, under state law, there are no competitive procurement requirements that apply if the estimated cost of your purchase or your construction repair contract is below $30,000 and for your service category contracts. Now, oftentimes, if it's a large service contract, you might put out an RFP process, right? Go through an RFP process. You want to get competitive. What are some reasons why you want to get competitive pricing on a service contract? Get lower cost.
Especially when someone knows their competitors going for it.
Right, drive the cost down. Maybe you've had this one vendor under contract for 5, 6, 10 years. You want to shake it up a little bit. solid waste collection, garbage collection is a service. And typically those contracts are let in multi-year contracts and they cost millions of dollars. What do you think the taxpayers would say if you just went out and hired whoever based on whatever? Might be concerns about transparency. Your governing board may be uncomfortable in spending a lot of money. So it's not uncommon for local governments to use service contracts and use the RFP process for service contracts. But that's not required by state law, which comes as a great surprise to people. Now, let me just, this is my one digression into federal law, just to highlight something for you. Under federal law, the procurement requirements that attach to federal grant funds that I mentioned earlier, the Grants Management Common Rule, the types of contracts are basically the same. They only have one bid threshold, $100,000, where we have those multiple ones. And here's what it looks like under federal law. Their small purchase is like our informal bidding. See, I even color-coded it. You know, their sealed bidding is like our formal bidding, which was red. Their competitive proposal, price not considered, is like our mini Brooks Act. In fact, under federal law, it's called the Brooks Act. And we are the mini Brooks Act, not because Congressman Brooks, after who the federal law is named, was a short little man, but because the states have all adopted the federal law for hiring architects and engineers, and so the states tend to refer to their laws as mini Brooks, mirroring the federal law. In any event, okay, that's a digression. And then for the everything else category, small purchase applies below the threshold, just like purchase contracts, and then you use a competitive proposal method where you can consider price, in other words, an RFP process, if your service contract is above their threshold. What do you not see? What color do you not see in this? All right, so here's the state again.
Purple.
Blue.
You don't see blue, right?
Whatever on that.
Here's the point, yeah, these are the places on the state chart where it was blue. What's the point? What's the punchline here?
The federal's more restricted.
Federal's more restrictive. In what way?
That if you were using federal funds, you'd have to use the CPA, even if it was.
Right, under state law, you don't have to bid these contracts. You can, your local policies may require you to, but under state law, if you were to let a $5 million contract with an IT consultant to design something with IT.
I'm for hiring.
Under state law, I could just go straight out and say, you know, I think Allison has a lot of expertise. Girl, we're going to do some business, let's sign the contract. And under state law, that is totally legal. Allison, don't we wish, right?
Yep.
Under federal law, is that legal? No. Here's the punchline. Under federal law, when you are spending federal funds, there is some form of competitive procurement required for every type of contract, regardless of cost. So just keep that in mind. That's the punchline for federal law. There are no situations as a general proposition, except for some very, very specific exceptions. There's really no situation in which you can just spend federal funds and I can just go out and sign that contract with Allison for $5 million without having gone through a competitive process. That comes up incidentally since it's raining. This catches local governments. Can you think of an example where the difference here and here can be a really big problem for local governments? Think rain, think weather, think hurricanes, think tornadoes. FEMA reimbursement, debris removal contracts. Debris removal under state law is a service contract. So under state law, you are not required to competitively bid your debris removal contracts. But if you're going to get FEMA reimbursement, you have to have competitively bid that contract. And Hyde County got into trouble with hurricane, they had some real issues with Hurricane Irene because they let their debris removal contracts not fully compliant with the federal requirements, and they ended up having a significant amount of the debris costs we would be obligated. So you can be careful about that in any event.
This might be off the beaten track a little bit.
As opposed to us having been on the
Right.
beaten track.
How does minority contracting or minority bidding in state and or federal play into all this?
Great question. I have written with a law clerk last summer, a 42-page article about minority it is a page turner, let me tell you.
Well, I asked a question for you, Mike.
But I'm not going to go into all of that. What you're referring to under state law is called HUB, historically underutilized businesses, and under federal law it's DWBE, I can't remember the acronym in the federal law. Federal law is going to control if you're spending federal funds. If you're spending state or local funds, you look to the state HUB requirements. Though under state law, the minority participation requirements only apply to contracts for the construction or repair of a building, i.e. something with walls and a roof, that costs $300,000 or more. The formal HUB requirements. There are informal HUB requirements, which basically mean extra notice and opportunity for bidding for certified historically underutilized firms for building, construction, and repair between 30 and 300. HUB requirements do not apply to purchase contracts. HUB requirements do not apply to construction and repair contracts that don't involve buildings. So, and there we could get into a very, very lengthy discussion about what the HUB requirements are. They come into play under state bidding laws in that context. Does that answer your question for purposes of
Yeah,
now?
I was just curious because we've got a couple coming up, and I've heard our planner, our community development director, talk about in the contracts where we need to get competitive minority as well. So I was just curious on that.
Right, and if you're spending, you said community developers, so for example, if you're spending CDBG funds, right, those are going to come under the federal requirements and, excuse me, and their minority contracting provisions apply to all construction repair contracts regardless of the cost of the contract. So that's why it's coming up for you.
What about single-family rehab?
Pardon?
Single-family rehabilitation?
What about single-family
Same,
rehabilitation? If you're, are you spending CDBG grant funds? Or HUD maybe? Federal funds, USDA?
I'm not sure.
Okay. If you're spending federal funds, then yes, they're going to, the federal participation requirements are going to apply. As a general proposition. You know, there's this, I'm speaking very generally about very, very specific and technical federal regulations, but unless the agency tells you it doesn't apply, your starting point for your analysis, let me assume it does apply, and then let me check and make sure. So now, we're going to end at 11:30. I'm just looking at the time, although this is fun. I'm having great fun. It's half as much fun for you all as it is for me. I love talking about this stuff. So we now know our type of contract, and we know our cost, and we know the procure. Hey, come on in. And we know the. Would you be either Donna or Candace? Donna. Donna. There you go. Hi. Welcome. Good to have you here. So since we know we've started out very broad, and we've gotten more narrow, and we've now gone through our basic analysis. We've gone through the hard part of understanding state bidding laws, believe it or not. The rest gets very easy from here, from an analysis standpoint. The devil always is in the details, but you've now gotten to the point where, under state law, I know the type of contract, and if it's purchase or construction repair, and I know its cost. I know whether informal or formal bidding is going to apply, or if it's a service contract, I know, woohoo, I can, whatever. So at this point then, no, but the requirements are.
I'm not stuck on IT purchases, but IT purchases, I don't necessarily have to do an RFP. However, if local policies say I have to, then I have to do that. In other words,
Yes.
so I can't throw that card over the mail and do an RFP.
You can't just like throw away your local policies. I wouldn't
I answered
recommend
my
that.
question, but, yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, that was-
Okay, and we're gonna talk about local policies in just a minute. Okay, I know this is the worst PowerPoint slide in the history of all PowerPoint slides, right? Does this not make your head just spin? I show you this slide simply so that you can appreciate the fact that I somehow managed to get on one slide all of the basic requirements under state law for the 4 types of procurement methods.
Go back to the buttons.
Pardon? Go back to the button. Yeah, I just like showing this just because it took me forever to put it together. No, and seriously, the point of this slide is to demonstrate that once you have gone through the analysis that we've now gone through, okay, what is the cost of my contract? And say it's purchase and it costs $50,000. So I know that I am in an informal bidding. So now I can determine, do I have to do formal solicitation and advertisement? No. Am I required to have any sort of minimum number of bids? No. Do I have to do a public bid opening? No. What's my standard of award? Meaning, what's the basis upon which I make the decision of who to award the contract to? Lowest responsive, responsible bidder. We talked about that when we were talking about procurement methods. Do I have to take it to my governing board for approval? No. How does the public records law apply? So the point of showing you this slide is that from an analysis standpoint, once you get to here, state law is now going to tell you what these particular requirements are, your procedural requirements, how you have to advertise or not, you have to have a public bid opening, etc. So that's the point of this slide. Now, what I normally do at this point in the presentation is I walk through the 9 basic steps of contracting for purchase and construction and repair, and go through go through the particular statutory requirements that apply or don't apply, as the case may be, in each step. I'm not going to do that for you all now. I wanted to let you know that I'm getting ready to preview. I'm getting ready to skip over a whole bunch of slides, just like we're not going to get into exceptions, so that you know when you look at the information, if you want to use the slides, if you want to use them as a resource, you know what that is. I do want to, though, show the first one, because this is where I get a lot of questions. Your first step in your contracting process is you develop your specifications, right? You decide what it is you want. You write up your specs. And then you solicit, receive, etc. So when you're developing specifications, outside the context of construction and repair, certain types of construction and repair projects, state law really doesn't tell you how to develop your specs. There's no real specific procedural requirements that apply. So state laws don't govern what your operational objectives might be for that project or that contract, what your performance measures are going to be. It doesn't even say you have to have performance measures. The process you use for developing your specs, does the department head write them? Does the purchasing officer write them? Does it dictate to you what the details of those specs must be? It doesn't tell you that you have to have a specific evaluation matrix. So for example, with the Minnie Brooks Act, we're going to evaluate and determine who's the best qualified. Well, how do I do it mechanically? Just logistically, how do I do that? What does my grid look like? What is my matrix? What do I fill in the box? State law doesn't dictate that. What is your evaluation process when you get bids in? What does that look like? Is that done by one employee? Is it done by a committee, by a team? Who has to review it within your unit of local government? None of that's dictated or governed by state law. So how do you do that? Okay, this is not a rhetorical question. So how do you do that? Whatever. Legally, that's correct. I have best practices here to signal that this is where training with purchasers, the training that you're doing, talking with each other, communicating across the listservs becomes very, very important. And you look at what best practices are by other units of government. The point is, you can't go to the state statutes and look for this. You have to make it up and look to what best practices are and what's going to be applicable and important to your unit of government.
We were all waiting for the purchasing agent over here to tell us that.
Well, purchasing agents do a lot of training. My hat is off to purchasing agents because they do this every day and they have a tremendous amount of professional training. Their certification requirements are very, very stringent. Their recertification requirements are very, very stringent. And you guys go through a bunch of training and have a very, very active listserv in sharing best practices. Anybody got an RFP for this, that, or the other? So, yeah, just ask.
The listserv's great.
Yeah. So at lunch, y'all can all gang up on him and he'll tell you how to do it.
Well, you just send out, anybody got a sample?
Right. I mean, seriously, that listserv is chattering every day, multiple times during the day. So what, instead of going through the step-by-step of, okay, if it's a formal construction bid, you have to have a bid bond, or you know, 7 days advertising and all of that, what I want to do is hit some of these larger topics that, and just leave those other slides, the more detailed slides as a resource for you, and talk about some of the, go back and answer some of those questions we talked about at the beginning. When are bid documents open to public inspection? This goes to that point of confidentiality. It's proprietary. Well, it depends. How's that for a concise legal answer?
And redacted and subject to everyone.
Yeah. So this chart breaks down the application of the State Public Records Act to the bid process or the procurement process and the various documents. Let me first make sure everybody understand our state's public records law is not an access to information. It is a right of inspection to documents. Now that's a fundamental difference. You are under no legal obligation ever, if somebody calls you on the phone or comes into your office and asks you to tell you something, you're never under legal obligation to say something. You can, you don't have to though. What the public has a right of access to are documents. Does that make sense? That distinction is important in thinking about dealing with the bidding process, because the documents are going to be subject to public record at some point. But what you think about them, why you made a decision, if you didn't write it down, is not something that you're legally compelled to disclose. They can't sue you to tell them what was in your mind. But they can sue you to provide them access to documents. So, under the Public Records Act, in applying that to bid documents, there are going to be 3 different points in time when bid documents may be subject to public inspection. Or lunch. Oh, maybe that's lunch. Okay.
That's all right.
The building's not falling down.
It's a big box with HP on the side of it going down.
Oh, it's Carol's new printer. What was it?
It's like Carol's new printer.
Ah, okay, new printer?
Copier.
Copier.
Oh, I was gonna say, that's a big printer. So, 3 different points in time when, depending on the type of bid process or bidding you're doing, when the documents are gonna be subject to public inspection. When the bids are received, or if they are sealed when opened, when they are opened, and when the contract is awarded. If you are talking about, if you're looking at a purchase and construction below the informal bidding range, in the blue, remember the blue on the chart, Mini Brooks Act, so all of the responses you get back from architects and engineers, et cetera, and contracts in your everything else category, let's say you're using an RFP, unless the proposals are, oh no, they couldn't find the right unless the proposals are submitted to you sealed, meaning literally in an envelope, it's sealed, it's shut, it's shut. The minute that document comes into your possession, it's going to be subject to public inspection. Now, you don't have to engage in, the Mini Brooks Act does not require those proposed, the responses to your request for your qualification. The Mini Brooks Act doesn't require them to be submitted sealed. State law doesn't require that. So, if you're getting proposals from architects and engineers, for example, unless you tell them to submit them sealed, and most units will do that, the minute that proposal comes in, legally, somebody could have access to it. And the same if you're talking about purchase and construction below, let's say you're soliciting bids for a purchase of $10,000. You're not required to do competitive bidding under state law. Remember, that's in the blue area also on the arrow chart. But you're getting proposals anyway. You've sent out an email to a couple of vendors. You ask them to email back, to email some quotes. Those emails are a record. They're a document. They're covered under the Public Records Act. And they've not been submitted to you sealed. So the first one you call emails you in. The second one you call emails you in. The third one you call, he said, well, how many did you call before me? And remember, you don't have to tell them, but let's say you do. You say, oh, I've already called Joe and Jim. Well, what did Joe and Jim did? You're not required to say what they did. And you say, well, I'm not required to tell you that. I'll be down in your office in 5 minutes. I want to request a copy of the emails. That he has a legal right to get. So how do you deal with that? If you want to protect, when you're not required to get sealed bids, if you want to still have some competitive integrity, if you will, you want to have true competition, just have them be submitted to you sealed. Put it in an envelope, seal it, because the documents, the contents inside the envelope don't become open to public inspection until you open the envelope. Once you have access, you literally don't have access to those documents until you open the envelope, right? So until you open the envelope, the only thing somebody would have a right to inspect is the outside of the envelope. When opened, oops, sorry. When opened, formal purchase and construction contract bids. So purchase 90,000 and above, the red arrows. Construction and repair 500 and above. They're required by law to be submitted sealed. They're required by law to be opened in a public bid opening. The minute you open the envelope, the contents are subject to public inspection. When the contract is awarded, now that means not when you open them, not at any point during the bidding process, until you've actually made a contract award decision, which is very different if you think about it from this category and this category. Informal purchase and construction contracts. So, informal purchase, this is the purple, it was 30 to 90, right? Construction and repair, 30 to 500. Not subject to public inspection. There's been documents not subject to public inspection until a contract is awarded. And the optional ITROP, that optional process. So, what then is the answer to the question? Oh, I'm sorry, let me also mention this. Trade secrets. My information is proprietary. Do you all get that from IT vendors, I'm sure, pretty regularly. So what is the answer to the question? Keep this proprietary. Or you might even put in your solicitation for proposals or in your RFP. We will maintain confidentiality of all bid documents or all proposals received. Can you even legally do that? Now, if you're outside, let's assume you're not dealing with informal purchase and construction. No, you can't. The answer, you can't, unless the information, at some point in the process, these documents are going to be subject to public inspection. At some point. The only question is at what point in the process. Unless the information in the document constitutes a trade secret under North Carolina law. And I'm not going to go into the definition of a trade secret and all that is entailed within that. But the document, let's say you're going to you have to disclose this document, and the information in blue constitutes a trade secret and the information in white does not. I'm just making this up off the top of my head, but what do? You have to redact the blue and provide the rest of the document. I'm not going to get into trade secrets, but that is the one exception to the application of the Public Records Act in the context of bidding.
So would the onus be on the governing body or the vendor?
On the vendor.
Tell us what the trade secret was?
Yes, and in fact, I will tell you this about trade secrets. One of the criteria for qualifying as a trade secret under the Public Records Act, which then requires you to maintain the confidentiality of that information even after the bids have been opened, it has to be labeled either confidential or labeled a trade secret at the time the bid is submitted to you.
So it's not.
It cannot be done after the fact. So the vendor, that's the onus. Ultimately, the onus is on the vendor, but the first obligation is to mark the documents as trade secret. If that hasn't been done, it doesn't matter whether it's proprietary in their mind or not. It has not met the statutory criteria for being a confidential trade secret. And just because they've marked it confidential doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fit the definition. But the threshold, the first thing you look at is whether they even stamp the document or not. So, local preferences, remember our question, can you award to the vendor, the local vendor whose bid was only $250 more? And some of you thought that you could. The answer is pretty much, but not entirely, no. If the contract is subject to either informal or formal bidding, so it's either purple or red on the arrow chart, you have to award based on the lowest responsive responsible bidder standard of award. And that standard of award under North Carolina law does not take into account geographic preference as a basis for the award in and of itself. Now, if geographic proximity to your work location, for example, is a factor to whether or not that vendor can perform well under the contract, you can take it into account. So let me give you an example. A 911 system. You're putting in a new 911 system. You want to have part of the contract for putting in the system would be ongoing maintenance and troubleshooting. And let's say that because it's 911, you don't want the system to be down for more than, 15 or 20 minutes. One of your criteria is that they have to be able to have somebody physically on site within 20 minutes. Which seems reasonable to me if you're talking about 911. Well, one vendor may have a lower cost, but they are from out of state, and they can't meet that particular criteria of what your needs are. And the local vendor can. You can award to the local vendor in that instance, even if his bid is higher, because his geographic location goes to his ability to perform under the contract or to meet your requirements, not because he's local in and of himself. So,
I remember during Ryan Brown's presentation, he mentioned that there is a bill currently in North Carolina House that will allow local preference. Is that correct?
yes, and there was one last session as well.
Is it going to pass?
So far, it has not been even gotten hearing in committee yet.
Okay.
Local preferences, not to digress on that too much, but local preferences become very problematic very quickly from a practical standpoint. I'm not expressing an opinion one way or the other personally, but from a practical standpoint, because you start getting into the details of definitions. If you are going to have a preference legally, there has to be a clear definition in order to ensure that the preference is exercised correctly and meets this legal requirement. So, what is local? I did this exercise with the Greensboro Chamber of Commerce last year. There was a very big discussion going on with the chamber about a buy local preference bill, considering asking for legislation. And so I did this exercise with them, not expressing to suggest that I have an opinion, but to help them think through the details, because if you're going to do a policy or a local act, you have to have definitions. You've got to be able to define this stuff. And so what is local? If you're in Greensboro, is it the city? Is it the city and Guilford County? Is it, but they're in the triad region, right? So does that mean it's Greensboro and Guilford and Forsyth and Winston?
Well, yeah, it depends.
That's the problem. That's the problem. We actually did a survey, the chamber did a survey of its members prior to my workshop with them, asking them to define local, and gave them about 6 different options, and there was no consensus whatsoever. So it really can become a problem. So what is local? Who is local? What does it mean to be local? Once you decide, if you can, what local means, then who is local? Is it a business whose principal place of business is located within that geographic region? Does it mean they have a certain amount of capital investment within that geographic region? Does it mean that they employ X number of employees, or they have X amount of, you see what I'm saying? So who is local? Does it mean just because I paid a privilege license or a business license, does that make me local? Can I plunk one employee there and that makes me local? So the devil gets in the details pretty quickly, and that's why these bills tend to not pass. Catawba County had one filed in 2011, and it got pulled because of the concern about what's called retaliatory preferences. Well, I've got a preference in my county for my bidders, my vendors, my businesses in my county. But does business flow along the geographic boundaries of our counties? No. So I might be advantaging the businesses in my county, but what if the county next to me also gets a preference bill for their businesses? Now the businesses in my county are actually disadvantaged. And so retaliatory preferences are a big concern as well. But that's the basic gist of local preferences. Local policies versus state law. Local policies would be the little kitten, that would be state law. Remember the most restrictive rule, and it can sometimes be really confusing. Wait, do I have to bid this or not? Well, my local policy, my board says this and that and the other. Your local policies, you should always attempt to follow them. We don't have any case law in our state, however, that says what happens legally if you don't follow your local policy, but the contract still complies with state law. So I can't tell you that a court would say the contract's invalid. I certainly recommend that you always follow your local policies. And so here's an example of what we're talking about. And tell me what you think. The informal bid threshold, the beginning of the purple, at the state level is $30,000. What if your local policy sets it at a lower level at $5,000? What controls? That's right. Isn't that good? I did that animation too. I'm proud of myself. Okay, under state law, remember we had a question at the beginning, you only got 2 bids on the purchase of the IT equipment, could you open the bids? The 3-bid minimum under state law only applies to formal construction projects. Contracts in the formal construction range, 500 or more. There is no 3-bid minimum that applies to purchase contracts. But your local policy wants a 3-bid minimum for all contracts subject to informal bidding and formal bidding, both purchase and construction and repair. What controls? Yep. Service contracts, as we know, there's no bidding requirements under state law, but your local policies requires an RFP process for all service contracts over $100,000. So what controls? Yep. Now, bidding requirements in general. The whole universe of everything we've talked about as well as all that we've not. State law, it's Article 8 of Chapter 143, and let's say you have no local policy, then what controls? That's right. Does this help give you a sense of how to think about local versus state? Finally, give me 5 more minutes. Are you all good? Oh, you're good? Okay. 5 more minutes. All right, maybe 10. We can talk about the IT RFP for a minute. So we're going to switch now to the IT RFP. Allison, Lee, y'all can't laugh. You know what this is. So here we're switching now to procuring information technology goods and services. We've come down now very, very narrow and specific. Think of the last hour and a half as a great big funnel, and we've come down very specific to the work you do. We have here a classroom. And let's say this classroom, which it was in fact, has been rewired. It's made into a smart classroom. The school was made into a smart school. Incidentally, this dedicated public school teacher is my husband, and this is his math classroom in Manteo High School. And yes, I made the poor guy go in there and pose for me to do this particular exercise we're getting ready to go through. So what kind of IT stuff, things, components, aspects do you see in this classroom?
Overhead projector.
Yeah, there's a projector.
TV in the corner, by the door.
That stuff, yep.
Camera.
They're cabling.
Surveillance.
Where do you see the surveillance camera?
It's not loud.
Is that a surveillance camera? Smoke detector, that's the most common answer. Router, maybe? No, you see some cabling. What else do you see?
Is he holding a laptop?
He's holding something, yeah.
That's not a smart board, though.
No.
Or
It's a
video
regular
or light or
whiteboard.
something.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's the remote control for the projector.
And what do you think, if, let's say that, and this is in fact what happened, let's say this classroom was made into a smart classroom. It was rewired for technology after the building was built. It wasn't built this way. What else would have to happen? What other services or types of activity? Think about our 4 types of contracts. Yeah, installation. Somebody's going to have to be knocking out running the cabling up here through the roof. Might even have to be drilling holes in walls somewhere. So what kind of activity would that be? Think of our 4 types of contracts. Construction, repair. Might we have to even have an engineer or an architect as part of the project to make sure we're not drilling some big, huge hole through a particularly significant load-bearing wall. I have no idea what I just said, but I think it's so if I have to get that, if I have to get that kind of service, what's that covered by? Mini Brooks, yeah.
Purchase the equipment.
Yeah, I've got to purchase the stuff, so that's a purchase contract, right? What if I had an IT consultant, kind of one of these IT consultant people, like Allison in the $5 million contract, to help me design, not from an engineering standpoint, but just from a scoping out standpoint, this whole project? That'd be a service contract. So, yeah, we've got the projector in here, we've got the router, the sound system and the DVD player. He's holding a smart pad. There's the software that's projecting what he's drawing on his pad onto the screen. He's a geometry teacher, so he drew me a square. You got the cabling that's running, good eyes on whoever spotted the cabling, running up and it's going through the ceiling. So, remember our 4 types of contracts, and each contract has separate procurement methods. How do you do this project from a bidding and contracting standpoint? Everything else doesn't.
The mini Brooks is the.
Well, you got mini Brooks.
You have that for the engineer, so.
You have to have the mini. You've got the Mini Brooks Act that applies to the hiring the engineer. But does Mini Brooks Act apply to purchasing the stuff? No. If you bought over 90, I'm assuming this stuff would cost over $90,000 if you're redoing an entire school. Oh yeah, so that's formal bidding. Now, but you got construction, you may have to be hiring a general contractor to do the poking in. You might have to hire an electrical contractor to run the wiring and wire all this stuff in. Now that's going to be construction and repair, right? Then you got your service contract that's your design. How on earth, well, I guess you could have 15 different contracts, right, for one project.
Level, wouldn't it all fall under the?
Nope, because if you're dealing with purchases, these are silos. I should make these actually look like bar silos. Yeah, I should probably make it. If we'd gone through the whole tedious step-by-step process, you would be painfully acutely aware. These are silos. All right, now the predominant aspect rule works unless, I mean, you can't use the predominant aspect rule in a project like this because you absolutely legally can't do construction and repair. If you're talking about formal bidding, you're doing $500,000 or more worth of construction and repair alterations to that building, you've got to do that. You've got to follow the competitive bidding requirements for that construction contract. So how on earth do you do this without doing 15 different contracts?
You do, yeah, or you do.
And how can you do turnkey?
As an RFP.
And how can you do that as an RFP? That's right. Okay, wait for it. Here it comes. Ta-da! The General Assembly, in recognition of the complex nature of IT projects, where you're doing truly very much a hybrid combination of goods and services, sometimes with engineering, sometimes with construction thrown in, enacted a special IT RFP process that you can use for the acquisition of these types, for dealing with these types of projects, so that you don't have to let multiple projects and you really can do a turnkey. And it's one of the few instances in our state's bidding laws where you really can legally do a turnkey project.
That was good, then.
Yes, yes. It was actually enacted in 2001. So it's been there, I think it was in 01, maybe sort of earlier. So you don't have to use the IT RFP, but you can, and do so in lieu of these other competitive bidding requirements. So if you're proceeding under the IT RFP, all you have to do is follow the procedural requirements for that type of for that process, and you don't have to worry about all the others. So, what is IT under the statute? It's very broadly defined. Electronic data processing, telecommunications, these are the words right out of the statute, which as you can see are pretty broad, right? Microprocessors, softwares, and the services can include all of these: consulting, design, installation, training, maintenance, operation. So here are the processes, the procedures. You have to do formal advertisement, which means 7 days ad. Excuse me, 7 days ad. You evaluate the proposals based on the criteria you've established. So you write out what it is you want, and that's the criteria you evaluate on. Your standard of award, remember we talked about the lowest responsible bidder standard, that applies to purchases, construction, and repair, where you're focusing primarily on cost. You don't have to do that, you're not held to that strict standard for these types of contracts. It's more like the Mini Brooks Act, except you can also ask for cost up front. You look at the best overall proposal, and you can award the contract to what you determine, based on your criteria, is the best overall proposal. Even if whoever is best in your assessment is more expensive, their cost is higher than somebody else's. You can negotiate with any of the proposers. You can't do this in the regular competitive bidding environment. You get formal bids in for construction. Once you open bids, that's it. You can't sit there and negotiate with everybody around the bid table. Oh, you think you want to lower your price? No, wait, you want to lower your price, or you can't start doing a price war right there. You can't negotiate. You can under this process. The idea being you might put out a very broad scope of work, and you might get differing proposals back in. And this statute allows you legally to then go get more information, negotiate with anybody to arrive at the best what's going to best meet the needs of your unit of government, so long as you don't go outside the scope of your RFP.
How do you handle manufacturers that subvert the whole process?
What do you mean?
Well, one of the big issues that we deal with is if you go with, say you're a Cisco shop, or not, but say you are a Cisco shop. So you can put out an RFP that says, we have to have Cisco equipment, correct? Okay. A vendor can go to Cisco, a partner of Cisco, one of their partners can go to Cisco and say, we are working with Robinson County on this project. They can register with Cisco to get a lower price than their other partners.
Okay.
So they can come in at with a lower bid than everyone else, simply for that fact.
Okay.
And that's kind of a general practice with a lot of the manufacturers, big manufacturers.
And so the big manufacturers, I'm not quite sure I followed that chain.
It's like a vendor would get a better price consideration from their supplier and therefore pass on a lower cost to us.
Okay, okay. If you're dealing in the context of the traditional competitive bidding, the purple or the red, there's nothing that prohibits them from doing something that enables them to give you a lower cost.
As long as they meet the
It's law, right. How they get to that lower cost, unless they're violating interstate commerce laws, or, you see what I'm
So
saying?
typically what we do,
I mean, it's not, how they get to their cost is not your concern.
Right.
what we typically do though is, and I don't know if we may be violating some law by doing this, is we will contact Cisco and say we do not want any partner to be able to register with you.
Okay, there's nothing that prevents you from doing that
Okay.
either.
All right.
Why would you want to do that? Why do you not want to do the
Well,
lowest
because
cost?
we then want whoever gets awarded the contract
Mhm.
or the bid to then register with Cisco, so that their bid, they're giving us their lowest responsive bid based on their services and not on the discount they get from Cisco.
I got you, okay, okay. If you write that, particularly when we're not so much in the world of the RFP, because you've got more flexibility with best overall proposal, but in a straight up purchase, which is what it sounds like you're talking about, I am purchasing
Yeah.
Cisco equipment, and what's gonna come along with that is gonna be some maintenance or warranty or whatnot, but under the predominant aspect rule, what we're talking about is a
system
purchase.
or whatever.
Yeah, it's a purchase, and let's say, so we're gonna treat that as a purchase contract. How, when you're dealing with purchase contracts and construction and repair, the purple and the red arrows, how you write your specs then becomes critical. Because you're subject to the lowest responsible bidder standard of award. If you write in your specs, bidders will be considered non-responsive if they have pre-registered with Cisco. You can do that. And then that gives you the legal basis for rejecting that bid. You can't reject the bid just because you don't like the way the guy got to his pricing. But if you have a rational basis, there's a logical reason for you not to want those bidders to pre-register with Cisco, and what you just articulated to me makes perfect sense to me, then put that in your bid specs. And then that gives you, if you don't put that in your bid specs, you don't have a legally valid basis for rejecting that guy's bid, just because you don't like the way he did business, or because he did an end run around, you know? I would consider that a clever businessman. So your not liking his runaround, to me, means, hey, he's a smart guy, and you're getting the lowest cost. So what's wrong with that? Well, you've articulated a reason why that's not good for your unit of government. It's not giving you the ability to really look at their service cost. So the way you deal with that is put that restriction in your bid specs up front. How you write your specs, and remember the slide, the first step, how writing specs is not governed by state law. And this is where the training and experience of your purchasing officers becomes really, really critical. And your knowledge of your project becomes really critical. Thinking through, okay, we don't like the way this is happening, how can we stop it? 9 times out of 10, the way to address that is how you write your specs, because you are giving yourself then a legally valid basis for rejecting a bid, because it is not responsive to your specifications.
I mean, there are times when I've seen vendors who a lot of people have had problems with have come in lower than everyone else because of that.
Yeah.
And so we don't really want to deal with them because we know they're kind of known.
Because they provide bad service,
Yes.
but they get the low bid because they've got the
But aren't you saying the IT RFP doesn't matter? You take the best overall proposal.
If you let it that way,
Yeah.
if that's how you advertise, if you're treating it that way, if you're treating it as a straight up purchase.
We're
And
not
really, if what
justified
you're doing is just, and in my opinion, and I've gotten this question before, well, all we're really doing is just buying the equipment.
Right.
Can we still use the IT RFP? And in my opinion, that's not what this statute was intended for. We don't have any case law on that, so a judge may disagree with me if somebody ever sued. But if you're looking at this statute and reading the statute, and looking at the intent of the legislature behind enacting the statute, it really was intended for the kind of projects that we talked about with the larger jobs or the very complicated jobs.
Integration.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Integration.
Exactly.
There are multiple.
If I'm just buying a new phone system, if I'm just buying new telephones, not a whole redesign of my system, but I'm just buying new telephones, or I'm buying those things, in my opinion, you can't go through, I just bought one of those things for my husband last night.
An iPad? No, it's a.
It was bigger than that, and fortunately, my 13-year-old stepson knew how to set it up. So, but if all you're doing is buying iPads for your commissioners, in my opinion, that's not really an appropriate use of the statute. So now you're back to dealing with the traditional bidding requirements. And in that context, that's where writing your bid specs becomes very critical to your ability to truly evaluate and make your award decision consistent with the lowest responsible bidder standard of award in a way that's legally valid and also meets your needs. And the way you get to that initially, your first step, is in how you write your specs. With the IT, as we mentioned, saw earlier on our chart relating to public records laws, the proposals aren't public until the contract is awarded. The statute does not require governing board approval. You don't have to take this to council or to your board of commissioners for approval, these types of contracts. Your local policies may require that. And or even if they don't, if it's a multi-million-dollar contract, you probably want your governing board to approve it. But that's your choice. It's not required by statute. So that statute gives you a lot of flexibility in dealing with integration projects or large IT goods and services, the combination of these complicated projects. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go through the competitive bidding exceptions, but I do want to put the slide up here to see if any of these exceptions jog for you a particular burning question that you have. We have sole source, emergency contracting. Y'all don't buy fuel, I'm assuming. Force account work, that relates to using your own employees for doing construction and repair work. Buying off state and federal contract, piggybacking, change orders, again, that's specific to construction and repair. Buying from each other, making purchases from another unit of government. Group purchasing programs, or sometimes referred to as cooperative purchasing, like the Cisco convenience contract that the city of Jacksonville has. Come on in. Or buying used items. Are there any of these exceptions that right now, as lunch comes in, spark in your mind and especially burning question?
The group purchasing or the cooperative purchasing, is there something special about those that has to be there for us to consider? We can't just say, I want to use the state of Tennessee's contracts or.
Actually, you can. You would do that. A group purchasing program, it's referred to nationally, the nomenclature is, you tend to hear cooperative purchasing. North Carolina's statute calls it a competitive bidding group purchasing program. The nomenclature is immaterial, it's all the same. The group purchasing program is where some organization, a formally organized entity, it can be either local government, it can be a nonprofit like some of the big ones, U.S. Communities, for example, is a really big one. So formally organized, that has contracts that were entered into through a competitive bidding process. So that entity or that nonprofit got to use a competitive bidding process to enter into these contracts. And they're made available to at least 2 public agencies. That's the definition of a group purchasing program under North Carolina law. And so if the program and for example, the city of Jacksonville's convenience contract that was entered into on behalf of NCLGISA qualifies. As NCLGISA is a formally organized entity and the contract was competitively bid and it's available to 2 or more public agencies. That's the criteria. And so if it comes under, if the organization falls under that umbrella, then you can purchase items directly from vendors under contract with that organization and you don't have to competitively bid. If you wanted to buy off a contract with the state of Tennessee, let's say the state of Tennessee entered into some contract and you just want to buy the same stuff they bought under their contract, that is called piggybacking. And under piggybacking, that's more restrictive. You can piggyback off a contract if the contract was competitively bid within the previous 12 months and you're purchasing the same item at the same or more favorable prices, terms, and conditions. That's piggybacking, which is different from buying off state and federal contracts because you're buying from a vendor who's under contract with the state of North Carolina. So state and federal only means state of North Carolina, federal means federal government, federal agencies, GSA. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions about exceptions?
Or if they were getting ready to redo this Jacksonville, Cisco.
Yeah, okay.
This coming up for renewal.
Is it?
Cisco.
It's Cisco. Yeah, the Jacksonville convenience contract is convenience contract is another term that you tend to hear. The city of Charlotte also has, about 2 years ago, started a cooperative purchasing program. And they have built up a fair number of contracts that are available. People will buy off Charlotte. The city of Charlotte, yeah. So Charlotte.
Microsoft one or something.
I don't remember, they may have. But the city of Charlotte has for about 2 years ago formed a group purchasing program. And they've built up an impressive number of contracts in the last 2 years. So what I would like to leave you with, again, I'm skipping over these, not because we've run out of time, I'm doing this intentionally, but simply so that you know that information is here. I'm going to leave you with 2 resources. First, well, one resource that has lots of stuff on there. This is our local government purchasing site as part of the school of government's website. I don't know if you all are familiar with that. I know you are. It's www.ncpurchasing.unc.edu. And this is a website that the school of government has maintained for a number of years in which we provide resources for and information about local government purchasing requirements. There's a whole, for example, link the menu here. I encourage you to go on and play around on the site. If you wanted to join the purchasers listserv, for example, you can do so from this site. We've tried to make it a one-stop shop for all the resources that we have available related to local government purchasing and contracting. In particular, I just wanted to highlight the tools page. Tools are what we refer to as charts, graphs, checklists, cheat sheets, etc., about all these different laws. So we have a one-pager on here that lays out all those things we talked about. We've got a 2-page public contracts legal checklist. It's a 2-pager that has all the different statutory requirements that a basic public contract has to comply with. We have charts on the bidding laws, these charts right here. I'll map out for you all the various requirements. Remember my really, really horrible PowerPoint slide, the big chart where I squeezed all the requirements? Okay, that's spelled out in more detail in these charts here. We have a chart, the competitive bidding exceptions. I've got a multi-page chart that spells out all the exceptions, the statute citation, what kind of contracts they apply to, et cetera. So, I offer you this as a resource, an ongoing resource for you if you have a need to remember, refresh your memory or whatnot. Encourage you to make use of the site and to let me know if you were looking for something on the site and you didn't find it. Finally, we do have two resources. We have a local government law blog. Any of you familiar with our Coats Cannons blog? Are you now? Ah, yes, that's right, because you found it. At the school, our local government law faculty, we do a blog. It's a page turner because we post on topics related to local government law. So this is not your typical blog. It's not us chit-chatting or commenting on, gee, will the Zimmerman trial ever end? But it's designed to provide sort of short, quick summaries as a on different particular issues, or we use it oftentimes as a way to communicate about current events with the law, legislative update, et cetera. And so, for example, I did a blog that on the Minnie Brooks Act. It's frequently asked questions that I get a lot. So there's a whole list of FAQs on the Minnie Brooks Act in this particular blog. We have an entire category on purchasing and construction on our blog.
What's the connection with that photo?
Oh, you want to know what do you think?
Johnson.
Yes. Yeah, what is the Minnie Brooks Act?
Is that Brooks?
Yes, that would be Congressman Brooks.
Wow.
Congressman Brooks was a Republican congressman. Republican or Democrat? Actually, I can't remember.
That's him in the back?
Yes.
Circle,
It is.
yeah.
It looks like Lyndon Johnson in the front.
That is. And that is Mrs. Kennedy.
A long time ago.
What does hiring an engineer and President Kennedy's assassination have in common?
The investigation.
Boy, if you need an icebreaker at a cocktail party, man, I'm giving you some trivia questions that will just make you the life of the party. I have, by the way, I'm not getting invited to parties anymore now. I don't know why. I'm teasing. Yes, Congressman Brooks, who was the primary proponent and author of the Brooks Act, which established the qualifications-based selection process for hiring architects and engineers at the federal level, for which we have the Minnie Brooks Act. See, he's really not that short. He was a congressman from Texas, and he was in the motorcade in Dallas when President Kennedy was shot. He was in the car right behind President Kennedy because he was part of the congressional delegation from Texas when President Kennedy visited Dallas. And so this is that famous photograph aboard Air Force One when the Vice President is being sworn in, and he's standing next to Mrs. Kennedy, who still has on the pink suit that's blood-stained from her husband's blood, and there's Congressman Brooks. Another bit of trivia, history trivia, there is a woman here who is administering the oath to the now President. She was a local judge in Texas, and it was the first time that a woman administered the oath to the President. And she was just, I think, like a regular superior court judge. They had to find a judge somewhere. It was somewhat of an unusual set of circumstances. They had to find a judge. She was there. Can you imagine that poor woman? All of a sudden, she's being hauled onto Air Force One to swear in Lyndon Johnson because President Kennedy was then assassinated. So, yes, that's the connection between hiring an engineer and President Kennedy's assassination. I know when y'all are out trolling the bars and your banks to see what you're saying. So, are there any other questions that you all have? Burning issues, something you'd like me to answer for you? I want to leave you with my contact information in case you have questions down the road. You ready to eat? Take a break, eat? Well, I appreciate your, I went a little bit longer than I had intended, but I appreciate your indulgence. Your engagement. It's been a lot of fun to be with you this